Dr. Chen had discovered three fundamental truths during her 8 years as a xenobotanist aboard the research vessel Persephone. First, that exotic plants always wilted at the most inconvenient moments, usually right before important presentations. Second, that soil under fingernails was apparently permanent regardless of what hand soap manufacturers claimed. And third, that she possessed an almost supernatural ability to say exactly the wrong thing at formal events, even when she rehearsed appropriate responses for hours beforehand. All three truths were proving devastatingly accurate as she stood in the gleaming atrium of the Aquarian Embassy on Tethys Station, tugging at a dress that seemed designed by someone who believed humans should be decorative rather than functional. The Confluence Summit had transformed the embassy into something between an interstellar trade conference and an extremely elaborate garden party. Representatives from 32 aquatic civilizations filled the space, their various adaptations to water-based existence, creating a fascinating cross-section of evolutionary creativity. The Delphini delegation moved through water-filled transit tubes that crisscross a room like arterial highways. The Krell ambassador kept her gill slits moistened with a portable spray system that made soft hissing sounds. Two representatives from the Chorus Collective sang their conversations in harmonies that Kira's universal translator struggled to parse into linear language. Kira, representing the Terran Botanical Survey by virtue of her team winning the embassy garden renovation contract and her supervisor deciding someone presentable should attend, felt spectacularly out of place. She positioned herself near a massive water feature that cascaded down crystalline walls in defiance of several physical laws, tried to achieve the perfect balance of present but forgettable that would satisfy her professional obligations without requiring actual conversation. The Aquarians themselves commanded attention in ways that made terrestrial species seem slightly unfinished by comparison. Humanoid in basic configuration, they moved with fluid grace that made sense only when you remembered they'd evolved in environments where resistance came from water rather than air. Their skin held an iridescent quality that shifted between deep blues and greens depending on angle and emotion, and their eyes were larger than human standard, adapted for low-light ocean environments with pupils that could dilate to remarkable sizes. Their most distinctive feature, however, was their respiratory adaptation. While capable of breathing air for extended periods, they wore delicate gill collars, living symbiotic organisms that enhanced oxygen extraction and could be temporarily removed for formal occasions, though most Aquarians found this uncomfortable. The collars pulsed gently with bioluminescence, creating subtle light patterns that Kira suspected served as nonverbal communication. Prince Calder presided from a dais, surrounded by flowing water sculptures that seemed to respond to his presence. He wore his authority like other people wore comfortable clothing, the kind of natural command that didn't require announcement. His coloring ran toward the deeper blues, almost indigo in certain lighting, and his eyes held the bright turquoise of shallow tropical seas. He was beautiful in a way that made Kira extremely aware she was wearing borrowed formal attire that didn't fit properly and had forgotten to remove the sample labels from her sample collection kit, which she brought because leaving it in her quarters felt wrong. Beside the prince stood his son, Reef, and Kira felt the automatic sympathy anyone feels for children trapped in formal circumstances. He couldn't have been more than 7, wearing a smaller gill collar that pulsed with anxious orange patterns, fidgeting with the ceremonial sash that probably weighed more than seemed reasonable. His coloring held lighter tones than his father's, more green than blue, and his expression suggested he was enduring this with the grim determination of someone serving a mandatory sentence. The ceremony proceeded with exactly the enthusiasm one would expect from required diplomatic ritual. Ambassador Threllis of the Deep Current Confederation had been speaking for approximately 23 minutes about sustainable fishing quotas, his translator creating harmonics that made his words sound important even when discussing catch limits. Kira had discovered that if she mentally calculated the atmospheric exchange rates in the embassy's hydroponic gardens, intake vents near the floor, carbon dioxide scrubbers in the ceiling, accounting for thermal stratification and the varied respiratory needs of attending species, she could maintain an expression of polite attention while her mind did something useful. She was midway through estimating nitrogen fixation requirements when Prince Reef's head snapped sideways with the sudden focus of a sonar lock. His gill collar flared bright yellow-green with excitement, and several nearby courtiers noticed and shifted nervously. Kira, still thinking about nutrient cycling, didn't immediately realize he was looking directly at her through approximately 150 assembled dignitaries. Then he moved. Not walked, not proceeded with royal dignity, but ran. Actually ran, his ceremonial sash fly behind him like a cape designed by someone who hadn't anticipated physics. Straight through the crowd. Representatives parted in confused waves. Conversations dying mid-syllable. Ambassador Threllis stopped speaking, his translator falling silent in sequential shock. A serving attendant froze with a tray of drinks tilted at an angle that seemed to violate several beverage-related guidelines, the glasses somehow remaining perfectly level through sheer surprise. Kira had perhaps 2 seconds to process the small figure racing toward her before Prince Reef crashed into her legs with a full-body enthusiasm that only children and extremely friendly sea creatures can achieve. Small arms wrapped around her waist, and a voice muffled against her borrowed dress exclaimed with pure joy, "It's you?" "It's the plant lady." The atrium descended into a silence, so complete Kira could hear the Krell ambassador's spray system hissing 3 rows away. Every eye focused on her with the collective weight of diplomatic incident, and Kira stood frozen, looking down at the small, green-tinted child attached to her like he'd found something precious he'd been searching for. Her mind, usually reliable in botanical crisis, offered absolutely nothing useful. Somewhere in the higher functions, a memory tried to surface, but mostly she was aware that she was being hugged by royalty in front of representatives from 32 star systems and had no idea what protocol suggested as appropriate response. Prince Calder had risen from his seat. The movement was smooth, controlled, and somehow more threatening than if he'd leaped up shouting. His expression held the careful neutrality of someone calculating whether they were witnessing an adorable moment or security breach, possibly both simultaneously. His gill collar pulsed deep red, a color Kira's briefing materials had specifically identified as indicating extreme concern or anger. Embassy guards shifted position with the subtle precision of people prepared to intervene violently if required. Kira, still trying to restart her brain, looked down at Prince Reef. He looked up at her with an expression of absolute delight, his gill collar bright yellow gold with happiness. And finally, Kira's memory caught up with present crisis. 2 weeks ago, the station's botanical garden. Her lunch break between client meetings. A small child crying in the orchid section, overwhelmed by crowds. Clearly lost. She'd sat with him, asked if he wanted company while she waited for help. When he'd been too scared to talk, she'd done what her own grandmother had once done when Kira was young and frightened. Told stories, not grand adventures, just mundane disasters from her work. The time she'd accidentally cross-pollinated 2 species that should never been combined, creating a plant that smelled like rotting fish and grew at an alarming rate, filling an entire greenhouse before anyone realized what was happening. The incident with carnivorous vine that had developed a taste for synth meat and tried to eat her supervisor's lunch. She kept talking until he laughed, then kept going until station security and embassy guards arrived. 15 minutes of basic human decency for a scared child. Apparently, the scared child had been a prince, and apparently he remembered. Prince Calder descended from his dais with the kind of measured grace that made Kira think of deep ocean predators. Beautiful, slow-moving, and capable of crushing anything in their path. His gill collar had shifted from red to deep purple. Still not good, according to her briefing materials, but marginally better than red. His expression remained carefully neutral, which Kira's survival instinct interpreted as significantly worse than visible anger. At least with anger, you knew where you stood. Prince Reef showed no inclination to release his grip on Kira's waist. If anything, he tightened his hold, pressing his face against her dress like he'd found a life preserver in deep water and wasn't about to let go just because 150 diplomats were staring. The prince stopped 3 paces away, close enough that Kira could see his gill collar's bioluminescent patterns cycling through complex sequences. When he spoke, his voice carried through the silent atrium with crystalline clarity, and Kira understood why Aquarians considered human conversation endearingly chaotic. He barely seemed to raise his voice above conversational level, yet every syllable reached the far walls. Dr. Chen. Not a question. He knew her name, which meant someone had identified her very quickly. You will accompany me to a private audience immediately. The phrasing technically formed a request. The delivery made abundantly clear that requests from princes weren't actually optional. Kira attempted to bow respectfully while a small prince clung to her, achieved neither objective successfully, and settled for nodding with what she hoped resembled appropriate deference. "Of course, Your Highness." Reef finally loosened his grip enough to look up at his father, though he kept one hand firmly attached to Kira's dress. "Father, this is the plant lady I told you about from the garden. She told me about the fish smell plant and the meat-eating vine, and she let me help water the orchids." "Yes, darling." The prince's voice softened fractionally when addressing his son, though his eyes never left Kira. "We're going to discuss exactly that. You may come with us." The walk through embassy corridors felt like a condemned prisoner's final march, except the prisoner usually didn't have a cheerful 7-year-old holding their hand and chattering about how excited he was that his friend had come to visit. Guards flanked in precise intervals, their gill collars all displaying the same alert orange pattern, suggesting they were mentally calculating the most efficient methods to neutralize a human if said human made any threatening moves toward royalty. Kira tried not to think about neutralization. Instead, she focused on the embassy architecture, because focusing on technical details was how she avoided panicking in stressful situations. The corridors featured living walls, actual biological structures where engineered plants grew in sophisticated hydroponic systems, their roots visible through transparent panels, creating natural air filtration while adding humidity. The lighting came from bioluminescent organisms growing in carefully maintained colonies, their glow shifting color gradually to simulate natural day cycles. They entered a private chamber that somehow felt more intimidating than the atrium, specifically because it contained fewer witnesses. Comfortable seating arranged around a low table that appeared to be living wood, its surface smooth from careful cultivation, and the unmistakable sense that important decisions got made here, the kind that affected whether one left through the door or convenient airlock. Prince Calder settled into a chair with the fluid grace that apparently came standard with Aquarian royalty and gestured to a seat across from him. Reef immediately climbed into Kira's lap the moment she sat, forcing her to adjust her position awkwardly while trying to maintain some semblance of formal dignity. The prince watched this with an expression Kira couldn't interpret, his gill collar cycling through muted blues and greens. "Explain," he said simply, "exactly what happened at the botanical garden 2 weeks ago." Kira swallowed, extremely aware that her mouth had gone dry and that she was sweating through clothing she'd have to return to the embassy's courtesy service. "I was on my lunch break between client meetings. I'd stopped at the garden to check on some species samples I'd donated, and I saw..." She glanced down at Reef, who was watching her with rapt attention. "I saw him sitting in the orchid section crying. He looked lost and scared, and there were a lot of people around not noticing, and I just..." She trailed off, realizing how inadequate it sounded. "I couldn't just walk past a scared child. So you approached a distressed child you didn't know." The prince's voice remained neutral, but Kira detected the edge beneath. In a crowded public space. "Alone." "I stayed in public view the entire time," Kira said quickly. "I didn't try to take him anywhere. I just sat nearby and asked if he wanted company while we waited for help. He was too upset to really talk at first, so She felt her face heat with embarrassment at how ridiculous this would sound. "I told him stories about work, about the stupid mistakes I've made breeding plants." Reef chose this moment to contribute enthusiastically. "She told me about when she made the fish smell plant that ate the whole room, and when the eating plant tried to steal food, and she did funny voices for all the people yelling at her. I stayed with him until station security arrived," Kira continued, deciding to push through the mortification. "Then embassy guards showed up about 3 minutes later. They confirmed he was safe, and they took him home. The whole thing was maybe 20 minutes. I didn't think..." She stopped, realizing the problem. "I didn't know who he was. I just saw a child who needed help." Something shifted in the prince's expression, subtle but unmistakable. His gill collar brightened slightly, shifting toward warmer blues. "You didn't recognize him." "Should I have?" Kira asked, then immediately regretted the question as possibly insulting. "I mean, I'd only been on Tethys Station for 3 days at that point, and I was mostly meeting with technical staff about the garden renovation contract, and I don't generally assume crying children in public gardens are royalty, and..." She was babbling. She made herself stop. The prince studied her for a long moment, his large eyes unnervingly direct. "My son," he said carefully, does not typically demonstrate such enthusiasm toward strangers. He's reserved, even with family members. Slow to trust. The royal tutors consider it appropriate caution for his position. His gaze dropped to Reef, who had curled comfortably against Kira like he'd found his favorite chair. He spoke of you for 2 weeks. Asked repeatedly when the funny lady with the kind eyes might visit the embassy. I dismissed it as childhood fancy, an exaggerated memory of a brief kindness. I have very average eyes, Kira said without thinking, then wondered that sounded like she was arguing with the prince's assessment of her appearance, which seemed diplomatically unwise. The corner of Calder's mouth twitched just fractionally, his gill collar flashing with a pattern Kira had learned meant amusement. He asked about you during state dinners. He drew pictures of you for his art tutor, apparently depicting the incident with the carnivorous vine, which his tutor found deeply confusing without context. He announced to the Minister of Education that he wanted to learn xenobotany because his friend was a botanist, and botany seemed much more interesting than maritime law. The almost smile faded. I need to understand, Dr. Chen, why my son trusts you enough to run through a formal diplomatic reception and embrace you in front of representatives from 32 star systems. Kira looked down at Reef, who had dozed off against her chest with a rapid transition to sleep that small children managed effortlessly. Honestly, Your Highness, I have no idea. I just didn't want him to be scared and alone. She searched for adequate words. That seemed like the bare minimum of being a decent person. The prince was silent for several long moments, his gill collar shifting through minute adjustments that Kira suspected indicated complex thought processes. Finally, he said, most people who encountered the lost prince of the Aquarian Consortium would have seen opportunity, political leverage, ransom potential, a chance to gain favor or extract promises. His eyes fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. You saw a scared child and told him jokes about botanical disasters until he laughed. The fish smell plant story is pretty universally funny, Kira offered weakly. The cleanup crew still won't let me near experimental hybrids without supervision. This time, the prince definitely smiled. A brief flash of genuine amusement that transformed his face from intimidating sovereign to something more human, more tired, more real. You're either remarkably genuine or an extremely skilled actor, Dr. Chen. I'm a terrible actor, Kira assured him. I once tried to call in sick, and my supervisor knew I was lying within 4 words. I have no ability to deceive anyone about anything. That, Prince Calder said quietly, is becoming apparent. A soft chime interrupted the moment. A guard entered with the careful neutrality of someone interrupting royalty with practiced frequency. Your Highness, the prince's tutors are concerned about his schedule. His afternoon lessons will be canceled today, the prince said firmly. He looked at Reef, sleeping against Kira, then back at her. My son has clearly decided you're important, and I've learned that arguing with him when he's this determined achieves nothing except mutual frustration. He paused, and Kira sensed a decision being made in real time. Your survey team won the garden renovation contract for the embassy. Would you be willing to serve as the on-site project botanist? It would require residence in the guest quarters, proximity to the royal family, and deal with the fact that my son has apparently adopted you without consulting anyone about the decision. Kira's brain tried to process several implications simultaneously and failed at all of them. You wanted to live here? In the embassy? I want, Calder said, his voice carrying layers of meaning Kira didn't fully understand, to determine if my son's instincts are correct about you, and that requires more than a 20-minute conversation. He stood with fluid grace. You're free to decline, of course, but I suspect refusing would disappoint Reef considerably. Kira looked down at the sleeping prince using her chest as a pillow, thought about her cramped quarters in the research section, and wondered what her supervisor would say about extended royal proximity. Then she looked back at Prince Calder, whose expression remained carefully neutral, but whose gill collar had brightened to warm gold, waiting for her answer. I guess I should request my things be sent over, she said. The embassy guest quarters turned out to be significantly nicer than anywhere Kira had ever lived, which made sense given that her previous residences had included a converted storage module on a mining asteroid and an apartment where the recycling system made concerning noises at 3-hour intervals. Her new quarters featured actual windows that looked out over the station's central habitat ring, furniture that appeared grown rather than manufactured, and a bathroom with water pressure that seemed physically impossible but worked anyway. She'd been there for 3 weeks when Prince Reef discovered the greenhouse maintenance tunnels. Kira was 2 levels deep in the embassy's hydroponic infrastructure, running diagnostics on a nutrient delivery system that had been installed during what she privately considered the let's just add more pumps and hope era of agricultural engineering, when she heard a voice echo down through the access tunnel above her. "Kira, are you down there? I can hear the water pumps." She looked up to see Reef's face peering down through the maintenance hatch, his lighter green coloring distinctive in the tunnel's bioluminescent lighting. He was supposed to be in his afternoon history lesson, which Kira knew because she'd been specifically briefed on his schedule to avoid accidental interruptions of royal education. "How did you find me?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Aquarian hearing was adapted for underwater acoustics and could probably track subtle vibrations through solid structures. "I listened for the pump sounds," he said cheerfully, his gill collar flashing bright yellow with excitement. "Can I come down? This looks much more interesting than reading about ancient trade agreements." Kira considered the numerous reasons this was a terrible idea, including but not limited to safety regulations, royal protocol, the likely reaction of Reef's tutors when they discovered their student had vanished, and the possibility that Prince Calder would have her ejected from the embassy through the nearest airlock for losing track of the sun. Then she looked at Reef's hopeful expression and heard herself say, "There's a ladder about 2 meters to your left. Be careful." He descended with the fearless efficiency of children who hadn't yet learned that heights were supposed to be intimidating, and moments later stood beside her in the cramped maintenance space, looking around with fascination at the tangle of pipes, nutrient lines, and monitoring equipment that kept the embassy's gardens thriving. "What are you fixing?" he asked, reaching toward a control panel before Kira gently redirected his hand. "That panel controls high-pressure nutrient flow," she said, "which would spray you with concentrated fertilizer solution that smells like death and takes weeks to wash out. Let's look at this instead." She pulled up a holographic display showing nutrient distribution patterns through the sector, colored streams representing different mineral compositions for different plant species. "See how this section has to provide high nitrogen solution for the fast-growing decorative vines, but this adjacent bed needs phosphorus-heavy mix of flowering plants?" Reef studied the display with intense concentration, his gill collar pulsing with interested blues and greens. "How does it know not to mix them?" "Pressure differentials, flow regulators, and about 6 redundant safety systems," Kira explained, highlighting the relevant components, plus a really paranoid botanist who triple-checks everything because mixing those solutions wrong would kill an entire season's worth of plants. "You're that botanist?" "I'm definitely paranoid enough," Kira confirmed. She spent the next 30 minutes explaining hydroponic systems in terms a 7-year-old could understand, which required creative analogies involving rivers, waterfalls, and one memorable comparison between nutrient zones and neighboring families who needed separate dinner tables to avoid arguing. Reef asked questions with the kind of relentless curiosity that suggested he actually cared about the answers rather than just being polite, and Kira found herself genuinely enjoying the explanation in ways she never did with adults who always seemed vaguely disappointed that xenobotany wasn't more glamorous. They were discussing the finer points of pH balance when a voice called down from above, tight with barely controlled panic, "Prince Reef, Prince Reef, if you can hear me, please respond." Reef's gill collar shifted to anxious orange. "That's Instructor Meredith. She's nice, but she worries a lot." "Probably because her student disappeared during a lesson," Kira suggested. "You should answer her before embassy security locks down the entire sector looking for you." Reef called up through the access tunnel, and moments later they emerged to find not just his tutor, but 4 embassy guards, 2 attendants, and Chancellor Prydes, whose expression suggested she was mentally composing strongly worded memos about visiting botanists who enabled royal truancy. "Prince Reef," Instructor Merritt said, relief and exasperation mixing in her voice, her gill collar flashing with conflicting colors. "You cannot simply leave your lessons to explore maintenance tunnels. Your father will—" She stopped, clearly editing herself. "Your father will be informed." Reef maintained an impressive diplomatic neutrality that he definitely learned from watching Prince Calder. I was pursuing educational opportunities in applied xenobotany. Dr. Chen taught me about nutrient distribution and hydroponic cultivation for multiple species habitats. Chancellor Pridus's expression suggested she recognized political maneuvering when she heard it, even from a 7-year-old. Her gill collar pulsed with a pattern Kira's translator identified as skeptical amusement. Educational opportunities, she repeated carefully. He actually learned quite a bit, Kira offered, deciding that if she was already in trouble, she might as well commit fully. He correctly explained how the embassy maintains separate nutrient zones for different plant species, including the chemical reasons why you can't just mix high nitrogen and high phosphorus solutions. Because it kills the plants, Reef added helpfully. Very expensive dead plants. The Chancellor looked between Kira and the Prince, seemed to calculate several competing priorities, and finally gestured to the guards. Escort Prince Reef back to his quarters. Inform His Highness that his son is safe and has been pursuing educational opportunities. The way she said it made clear exactly what she thought of that excuse. Dr. Chen, you'll accompany me. They walked through embassy corridors in silence that felt deliberately uncomfortable, and Kira mentally prepared various apologies and explanations that all sounded equally inadequate. Chancellor Pridus finally spoke when they reached a private office that overlooked the gardens. You've been here 3 weeks, the Chancellor said, settling behind a desk that looked carved from a single piece of living wood. In that time, Prince Reef has skipped 4 formal lessons to find you, convinced his combat instructor to demonstrate defensive techniques using hypothetical plant-based hazards, and announced to the Council of Advisors that he's decided to pursue xenobotany rather than traditional royal studies. She fixed Kira with a stare that suggested she perfected the art of making people uncomfortable over decades of practice, her gill collar displaying neutral browns. You're either a remarkably bad influence or exactly what he needs. I haven't determined which. Kira, who had no good response to that, said, the nutrient distribution explanation really was educational. I'm sure, Chancellor Pridus said dryly. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted slightly, her gill collar warming to gentler blues. Prince Reef has been isolated. His mother died when he was 4. His father is Prince Regent, which means he has approximately 20 minutes per day for being simply a father rather than a sovereign. The embassy staff are loyal but formal. His tutors are competent, but treat him like porcelain that might break if handled incorrectly. She leaned forward slightly. Then you arrived and apparently decided to treat him like a normal child who might enjoy learning about exploding nutrient systems. Is that bad? Kira asked cautiously. I honestly don't know, the Chancellor admitted, but I do know that the Prince has noticed. Everyone has noticed. The young Prince, who barely smiled before, now laughs loudly enough to disrupt court proceedings when he's explaining something you taught him. Her gill collar swirled in complex patterns Kira couldn't interpret. You're either very good at long-term manipulation, which I doubt given your complete inability to navigate basic political courtesy, or you're genuinely kind to a child who desperately needed someone to be simply kind without ulterior motive. I just like teaching, Kira said, and he asks really good questions. Chancellor Pridus studied her for a long moment, then did something unexpected. She smiled brief but genuine, her gill collar flashing warm gold. Keep teaching him, Dr. Chen, but perhaps inform his tutors before he disappears into maintenance tunnels. It reduces the number of security alerts we need to process. That evening, Kira was invited to join the royal family for informal dinner, which turned out to mean a private dining room, where Reef monopolized conversation by explaining everything he'd learned about hydroponic systems, while Prince Calder listened with an expression that cycled between amused, exasperated, and something softer that Kira caught when he looked at her while his son was distracted by demonstrating nutrient flow using water glasses. After Reef was taken to bed by his attendants, still talking about pH balance, Calder gestured for Kira to remain. They stood on the balcony overlooking gardens that glowed softly with bioluminescent flowers, and the prince spoke without looking at her. He's different since you arrived. Lighter, more curious about things beyond duty and protocol. A pause, his gill collar pulsing with vulnerable blues. I don't know if I should thank you or worry about what happens when you eventually leave. I signed a 6-month contract, Kira said. I'm not leaving soon. 6 months isn't forever. Calder turned to face her, and Kira saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Vulnerability carefully revealed. She's already attached to you. When you're gone. Then we'll handle that when it happens, Kira interrupted gently. But right now he's happy. Isn't that worth something? Prince Calder looked at her for a long moment, his turquoise eyes reflecting the garden's soft light, his gill collar brightening to warm gold, and Kira suddenly felt like she was being evaluated for something far more important than xenobotany. Yes, he said quietly. It's worth quite a lot. Kira was reviewing nutrient protocols in her quarters when the emergency alert pierced through the embassy's usual calm. Not the standard maintenance alarm she'd heard occasionally, but something sharper, more urgent, accompanied by a pattern of flashing lights that her security briefing had specifically identified as catastrophic threat. Seek shelter immediately. She was moving before conscious thought caught up, heading toward a secure wing where Reef's chambers were located, because her first instinct when hearing catastrophic threat in an embassy containing a 7-year-old who becomes something like family was to make sure he was safe. She made it 4 corridors before running directly into an embassy guard who redirected her firmly back toward her quarters with the kind of professional force that suggested arguing would result in unconsciousness. Guest wing is in lockdown, the guard said, his gill collar flashing urgent red. Return to your room. Seal the door. Wait for all clear. What's happening? Kira asked, already knowing she wouldn't get a useful answer. Security situation. Move. Kira moved, but her mind was racing through possibilities, none of them good. She sealed herself in her quarters as instructed and immediately did what any botanist would do when told to wait passively. She accessed the embassy's environmental systems diagnostic network, which she had legitimate clearance for, and started tracing unusual activity patterns. It took her 6 minutes to realize that something was very wrong in the East Wing. Life support readings showed unexpected fluctuations, movement patterns that didn't match normal embassy operations, and most concerning, a bypass activation in the atmospheric separation system near the royal family's private chambers. Someone who knew embassy systems had deliberately created a gap in security protocols, using environmental infrastructure as cover. Her personal comm panel chimed with an incoming call from Chancellor Prytus, the Chancellor's face appearing with unusual urgency, her gill collar flashing rapid orange and red patterns. Dr. Chen, I need you to listen very carefully. We have a situation involving Prince Reef. Hostile actors have breached the embassy using maintenance access routes, specifically hydroponic service tunnels. They appear to have significant knowledge of embassy infrastructure. Kira felt her stomach drop. Where's Reef? Secured in his chambers with 3 guards. But the hostiles are moving toward that sector using pathways that bypass our standard security. We're mobilizing response teams, but Prytus's expression tightened. You know the hydroponic systems better than anyone currently in the embassy. Can you access your diagnostic systems from your quarters? Already doing it, Kira said, pulling up holographic displays. I see the breach pattern. They're using the service tunnels, staying in blind spots between sensor coverage. Her hands moved rapidly across controls. How many hostiles? At least 5 confirmed, possibly more. They're equipped with portable life support, sophisticated enough to handle atmospheric variations. The Prince region is demanding I evacuate you from the embassy immediately for your safety, but I'm making an executive decision that he's going to be very angry about later. Can you guide our security teams through those maintenance routes faster than the hostiles can move? Kira was already mapping trajectories, calculating movement speeds through different tunnel configurations, factoring the fact that people unfamiliar with hydroponic systems would have to move more cautiously than someone who knew exactly which pipes could support human weight and which ones would burst under pressure. I can do better than that. I can make those tunnels extremely uncomfortable for anyone trying to use them. Do it. Kira's fingers flew across controls, accessing environmental regulation systems that she'd spent 3 weeks optimizing. She started redirecting nutrient flows, creating pressure buildups that would make certain tunnels difficult to traverse without significant discomfort, strategically venting areas to drop temperatures, releasing harmless but pungent compounds that would make breathing unpleasant and trigger watering eyes. Nothing lethal. She wasn't trying to kill anyone, just slow them down and make them miserable. Through her monitoring systems, she watched hostile movement patterns stutter and redirect as they encountered her modifications. But they were still advancing, still getting closer to Reef's chambers, and Kira realized with cold clarity that her environmental manipulations would only buy time, not stop determined attackers. She made a decision that was either brave or catastrophically stupid, possibly both. Chancellor Prytus, I can reach Reef's chambers faster than your security teams using the maintenance routes. I know every access point, every shortcut, and I can move through those tunnels faster than anyone because I literally designed half the modifications. Absolutely not, Prytus said flatly. You're a civilian botanist, not security personnel. The Prince Regent would want his son protected by someone who knows the embassy infrastructure better than the people trying to reach him. Kira interrupted. I'm not going to fight anyone. I'm going to get to Reef and guide him through maintenance routes that these hostiles don't know exist, getting him to safety while your security teams corner them from behind. There was a pause where Kira could practically hear the Chancellor calculating political ramifications against practical necessity. Finally, if you die doing this, I'm going to have a very uncomfortable conversation with His Highness about why I authorized it. If I die doing this, that conversation will be the least of your problems, Kira pointed out. She was already moving, grabbing a portable diagnostic tablet and heading for the nearest maintenance access point in her quarters. Keep security teams pushing from their position. I'll contact you when I have Reef. The maintenance tunnels felt different in emergency conditions. The normal, comfortable hum of hydroponic systems replaced with the alterations Kira had introduced. Pressure fluctuations that made her ears pop. Temperature variations that cycle between uncomfortably warm and distinctly chilly. Atmospheric compositions that made her eyes water slightly. She moved through the infrastructure with practice efficiency, using access routes she'd mapped during her optimization work, traveling through spaces that weren't on official embassy schematics because they'd been added piecemeal over decades of system upgrades. She reached the junction near Reef's chambers in 11 minutes, emerging through a maintenance hatch that opened into a service corridor. 3 embassy guards stood outside his door, weapons ready, gill collars flashing combat red, and all 3 swung toward Kira with a kind of rapid targeting that suggested that they were prepared to shoot first and identify target second. Dr. Chen, one guard said, recognition stopping him from doing anything immediately violent. How did you? Maintenance tunnels. There are hostiles using the same routes about 5 minutes behind me. I'm getting Reef out through pathways they don't know about. Kira moved to the door. Is he? The door opened before she finished asking, and Reef stood there with 2 attendants behind him, the prince's expression showing more anger than fear, his gill collar flashing bright orange. Kira, did you make all the air weird? The guards won't tell me what's happening, and Instructor Meredith is being very calm, which means something bad is happening. Remember when I explained how the maintenance tunnels connect throughout the embassy? Kira interrupted gently. How there are routes that go places most people don't know about. Reef's gill collar brightened to interested yellow-green. The secret paths you showed me on the diagrams. Those exactly. We're going to take a walk through some of them right now, very quickly, and it's going to be an adventure. She looked at the guards and attendants. Standard evacuation routes are compromised. I can get him to the secure bunker near the council chambers using hydroponic maintenance access. It'll be uncomfortable, but safe. One guard started to object. Then his comm unit crackled with Chancellor Prytus's voice. Authorization confirmed. Chen, proceed. Guards, maintain position and prepare for hostile contact. Kira held out her hand to Reef, who took it without hesitation, his small fingers gripping hers with complete trust. This is like the stories you tell, he said as they moved into the maintenance access. The ones where everything goes wrong, but you fix it. Exactly like that. Kira agreed, guiding him into the tunnel system. Except this time, you're helping me remember which direction to go. They moved through the infrastructure quickly but carefully. Kira choosing routes that required climbing but weren't dangerous, passages that were uncomfortable but navigable for a child. Reef kept up remarkably well, his Aquarian hearing tracking sounds through the tunnels that Kira couldn't detect, occasionally whispering warnings about footsteps that way, or voices behind us that help her adjust their route. They emerged in a service corridor 2 levels below the council chambers. Just as embassy security teams cornered the hostile group in the maintenance tunnels Kira had deliberately funneled them into, Chancellor Prytus was waiting with Prince Calder, who looked at Kira with an expression that cycled rapidly through relief, fury, gratitude, and something else entirely before he dropped his knees and pulled Reef into an embrace that looked almost painful in its intensity. "Father, we took the secret paths," Reef said excitedly, apparently processing the entire experience as adventure rather than danger, his gill collar bright yellow gold. Kira knew all the best routes, and we climbed through the big nutrient tunnel. And "I'm aware," Calder said, his voice tight, gill collar flashing with conflicting emotions. He looked up at Kira over his son's head, and she saw moisture in his turquoise eyes that might have been tears or might have been fury, or possibly both. "We will discuss your decision to run toward danger rather than away from it, at length, later. Looking forward to it," Kira said weakly, her adrenaline finally crashing and leaving her shaky. The aftermath involved extensive security debriefings where Kira explained exactly how she'd use hydroponic systems to herd hostiles into capture zones. Several tense conversations with Chancellor Prytus about appropriate civilian responses to security threats, and one very long private audience with Prince Calder where he alternated between thanking her and looking like he wanted to shake her for taking unnecessary risks. "You could have been killed," he said finally, standing in his private office where they'd ended up after hours of security protocols, his gill collar pulsing with agitated patterns. "I could not try," Kira said simply. "He's—" She stopped, trying to find words for what Reef had become to her. "He's important. Not because he's a prince. Because he's himself." Calder was quiet for a long moment, his gill collar shifting through subtle movements. The hostiles were from the Terra Puris movement, extremists who view increasing cooperation between species as cultural contamination. They targeted Reef specifically because his attachment to you represents everything they oppose. He met her eyes, his gill collar deepening to vulnerable blues. You became a vulnerability in his security profile. "I know," Kira said. "I understand if you need me to leave." "Leave." Calder's expression shifted to something almost like anger, his gill collar flashing bright red. "Kira, you use your knowledge of systems you spent weeks optimizing to protect my son. You moved through embassy infrastructure like you built it yourself. You kept him calm and safe while guiding him through maintenance tunnels that most adults would find claustrophobic and terrifying." He moved closer, his gill collar shifting to warm golds. "Chancellor Prytus wants to offer you a permanent position as chief xenobotanist. The Security Council wants to formalize your access to embassy systems because you clearly use them more effectively than anyone else. And He stopped, something vulnerable crossing his face. "I want you to stay because my son is happier than I've seen him since his mother died, and because watching you with him makes me remember that trust and kindness matter more than protocol."